Hello. So this video is going to talk to you about how to format a business letter. So this is a significant traditional genre of writing for business and professional communication. So what I'm going to show you today is a very traditional, conservative approach to formatting a business letter. There's actually a good amount of flexibility in the business letter format. So what I'm going to show you is some basic guidelines, and I'm going to try and talk you through some places where you have a little bit more flexibility and some places where you maybe want to be a little more traditional. So this is what the heading section of a business letter traditionally looks like. And this is what your sort of conclusion and your signature line tends to look like. I'm going to talk you through all of these things, starting with the first bit here. So the first thing that you typically want in a business letter is your address. So that would be a full street address, and then the date. You can skip a line between your address and the date if you want to, but you don't necessarily need to. Either way, that's up to you. Then, traditionally, you want 2 to 3 blank lines before the recipient's address. So in this case, I've put my office address. So my name, my department, the university, and my office address. When you put the recipient's address, if you know the individual person to whom you're writing, you want to make sure that you include that. You want to typically include the company or the organization that they work for if this is a professional communication, going to them in their capacity as someone working at that institution. So I'm not 100% sure about this, but I believe the reason that this formatting is traditional for a business letter is because in the old days people would actually fold pieces of paper so that the top portion would be basically the front of an envelope. And so this functioned as your return address, and this functioned as your address. Now, obviously today we no longer do that, and actually we haven't done that in a very, very long time. But I think this is a sort of residual holdover from when people did do that, when paper was much more expensive, and so you didn't want to waste envelopes and things like that. So you just used the top, say, quarter of a page as the front of an envelope. So again, you want to set this up generally this way because it is a very traditional approach. Some of the things that you have flexibility about is where the date goes. In a personal letter, traditionally the date would go in the top right-hand corner, and some people are doing that now with business letters. So if you want a more old school traditional approach, you'd put it here under your address. If you want a bit more modern approach, you can put it over here in the top right hand corner. Another thing that people are doing less and less is skipping two to three spaces between addresses. So if you want a more slightly modern approach, you can just skip one space rather than the 2 to 3. But again, this is more traditional. So after the addresses, you're going to skip another line, and then you're going to put the salutation, which will be dear whoever it is that you're writing to. So in this case, it's dear Dr. Zapkin. This letter is addressed to me. So there's a couple of things you want to note here with the salutation. One is that you refer to the person by their title. So if they have a professional title, doctor, senator, professor, whatever it is, you would use that. If they if they don't have a professional title, or you don't know whether they have a professional title, you want to use Mr. for men, or you want to use Miss for women. So Mr. is pretty straightforward, I think. Miss is the sort of traditional business approach to titling all women, whether they're married or not. So unlike in sort of colloquial usage where we would make a distinction between Mrs. and Miss based on whether or not a woman is married, in business traditionally everything was Miss, MS period. There is a legitimate concern about misgendering people. That's increasingly becoming something that we as a society are aware of. And so, if possible, you do want to find out how the person that you're writing identifies, and you want to try and use the appropriate title. I'm not really sure whether there's a gender-neutral title in the Mr. Miss spectrum. That's something that I actually should look into. But for the moment, I'm going to leave that question aside. But again, you want to refer to the person by their title and last name. If you don't know the individual that you're writing to, you can write to a position title. So, for instance, if you're applying to a job and you don't know who does hiring for that organization, you could address, say, Dear Human Resources, or Dear Hiring Manager, or something like that. That's also acceptable if you don't know the individual. Then the last thing to note with the salutation is the punctuation following it. So traditionally, for business letters, this would be a colon. More and more these days, people are just using a comma, which is more traditional for a personal letter. So if you want to be more traditional and formal, then you can use a colon here. If you are less concerned about formality, less concerned about tradition, you could use a comma. Then you're going to skip another line, and then the body of the letter itself. Obviously, the content of the letter depends on your purpose, but you do want to be thinking about the general principles of business writing, which I've also done a video on, which you should be seeing a link for up in the top corner. But how you structure the letter is going to be in what's called block paragraphs, or block formatting. So basically, the first line of each paragraph is going to be flush with the left-hand margin, the same as subsequent lines. Block paragraphs are single-spaced, so if you want to make sure that your text is single-spaced, you can open up the paragraph menu in this little drop-down option here and select single spacing under line spacing. You also want to make sure that don't add space between paragraphs of the same style has a check mark in it. Otherwise, your spacing between paragraphs is going to end up extra large. Speaking of which, the way that you indicate paragraph breaks is by adding an extra line. So rather than indenting the way that you would in, say, MLA format or APA format or something like this, in block format, a line break indicates a paragraph break. You want to think about the font style and size that you're using, but there are no hard and fast guidelines for professional writing. You want something that's readable. So I like Bell MT, but that's just a personal arbitrary choice. There's a lot of other fonts you can use. Calibri or Arial are good if you want a sans serif font, whereas things like Georgia or Garamond are pretty good, as is Bell MT, if you want a serif font. And I'm going to do another video on serif versus sans serif fonts, and so you should be seeing a link for that as well. Then the last component of a business letter is the signature line. So this is a three-piece component. So first, you're going to include a closing. So this is a formal, usually single word, but it's not necessarily that. It can be a single word or a short phrase. So I tend to go with sincerely, which is one of the most traditional approaches. I've also heard people recommend using the word best. You can use regards, you could use best regards, something like that. But you want a traditional, formal, sort of single word, short phrase, whatever it is, followed by a comma. The next thing is you want to insert a signature, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. But then the last piece of a traditional signature line is your name printed. So this is done because people can't always read signatures, and so you want to make sure that your reader knows who is actually writing to them. And the reason that we need that is because if you go back up and look at the address at the top, you'll notice that it doesn't have the author's name. So when you put the address at the top of your business letters, it's just the address and not your name. Typically, the first time that we get your name in a business letter is down here in the signature line. So, in terms of inserting a signature, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. One of the most basic is to choose a font that looks cursive-y. So, Vladimir script, for instance. Because this is a very small font. If I was going to go with Vladimir script, I would want to increase the size of it. So that sort of looks like a signature, although it's clearly typed. Some people are fine with that. You could also choose, let me find it alphabetically here. Something like French script MT, which is also, again, going to look cursive. One of the potential problems with this approach of using a cursive font is that it's much, much easier to fake a signature this way. So this may or may not be viewed as legally binding, which is potentially a problem when you're doing business or professional transactions. So that is something you want to be aware of. There are also e-signature programs that you can use that will generate a signature that is generally regarded as legally binding. So that's another option that you have. The third option that you have is to take a picture of your signature and then insert that picture here. Now, there's a significant trick with this, and I'm going to show you how to do this, because if you just insert the signature as such, if you just insert an image as such, it will look terrible. So I'm going to show you how to do this with my own signature picture. So this is what I use when I'm writing, say, job application letters. Now, you'll notice if I just left it like this, it does not look like a signature on this page. It looks weird. So what you need to do is under the Picture Tools section, under Color, you want to select black and white 50%, and that's going to remove basically remove the background from the image and just leave you the signature on the page. So that's going to look much more professional and much more like you've actually signed this piece of paper without you having to print this letter out, sign it, and then scan it back in. So that's, for me, that's the way that I would recommend inserting a signature into a professional letter, unless you're actually physically printing that letter out anyway, at which point you can just go ahead and sign it.